Wade are both here for the people. Are we ready for our jury, Mr. Rubenstein?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Colvin?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and call for him. And Investigator Norcross, I'm going to invite her back up here and give her another oath today. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, sir. All right. Thank you. If you take the stand, please. Mr. Wade, do you have any other questions for the witness?
Your Honor, at this point, no.
No? All right. Thank you, Ms. Smith. Cross-examination whenever you're ready. Feel free to move the lectern if you wish to. Thanks.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay. So, just to be clear, Investigator Norcross, this interrogation of Mr. Jones lasted 2.5 hours, right?
Correct.
And during the course of it, you confronted him multiple times with having something to do with Ms. Bergfeld's disappearance.
Correct.
And every single time, he said no.
That's what he said. Correct.
And would you agree that he appears to figure out that you're accusing him of Ms. Bergfeld about 2 hours into the interrogation, right?
Yes, somewhere around that point. Yes.
And that at that point he says to you, "Are you saying I killed her?"
Yes.
And you say yes.
Yes.
And then would you agree that's really the first time you're explicitly accusing him of her murder?
Yes.
And he says, "I did not."
Correct.
And then from there until the end of the interrogation is really you accusing him of murdering Ms. Bergfeld and telling him you don't want to hear that he didn't do it.
I'm talking to
From when that first explicit interrogation, he tells you multiple times that he doesn't know where Ms. Bergfeld's at.
yes. Where I tell him that I believe he's responsible.
Yes.
Yes, because early on I told him that I was looking at trying to figure out whether people were or were not involved. That was early on.
Okay.
Within the first 10 minutes.
Okay,
So,
sure. But at no point, throughout the entire time, Mr. Jones tells you that he doesn't know where Ms. Bergfeld's at.
that's what he says. Correct.
Okay. And that he hasn't seen her,
Yes, he says that.
and he repeatedly says that he didn't kill her.
Yes.
unequivocally, he says these things.
He says those things, correct?
And perhaps you haven't counted, but would you agree it's over 10 times?
I haven't counted, I apologize. He said it numerous times.
Numerous times, okay. Now, Mr. Jones agreed to come to the sheriff's office that day for that interrogation, right?
Correct?
You understand that investigators had contacted him at work and asked if he would come down?
Correct?
And he drove himself down, right?
Correct?
And this wasn't a prearranged appointment at his convenience, right?
Correct?
And the whole time that Mr. Jones talks to you, this is voluntary on his part, right?
Correct?
He wasn't under arrest.
Correct?
You indicate the door is shut for privacy, not because he can't get out of it.
Correct. I say that every time I talk to somebody under these circumstances.
Okay. And you say that because it's true, right?
Correct?
Okay. And you ask him for his DNA, right?
Yes?
His fingerprints.
Yes?
And he gives you a DNA sample.
Yes, as we saw.
Okay. And then what we don't see is he's off getting his fingerprints taken, right?
Correct?
And not just fingerprints, but also palm prints.
Correct?
And when he leaves that portion we fast forwarded through, that's when he's out getting the finger and palm prints, right?
Yes, they do that at the front counter area of our office. We don't do it in that room.
Okay. So that's what I wanted to ask you about, that front counter area. That's in like the public lobby part of the sheriff's office, right?
It's in a room off the public lobby?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And their front entrance doors are right off that room, right?
Yes.
Okay. So he could have, at that point, been like, okay, you got my fingerprints, now I'm gonna go, right?
Yes, he could.
But he didn't, right?
Correct.
He came back with Investigator Pachota to rejoin you.
Correct?
Now, at the end of the interrogation, you tell him you're gonna seize his truck, right?
Correct.
And you ask for his keys and he gives them to you.
I ask if he wants to give them to me. He doesn't have to.
Right, okay, and he does give them to you.
Yes, he does.
Because if he didn't give them to you, you guys still could have done whatever you needed to, search the truck, even if he hadn't handed over his keys.
Yes.
But you indicate that makes it easier for you guys, and he did it.
Correct?
Now, Mr. Jones then was cooperative with this interrogation, right? Coming down to the sheriff's office, handing over his keys, right?
Yes.
Giving you DNA samples, fingerprints, right?
Yes.
So even though he was cooperative and at the end of the interview he gives you his keys, you don't ever ask him if you can get consent to search any of his belongings, right?
No, I do not.
So you don't ask him if Investigator Berg could have consent to search Bob Scott RV, his workplace there, right?
No, I didn't ask for consent. Because
Okay.
I knew I was going to go through a similar legal process. It's not called a court order, it's called a search warrant for writing up information, asking for permission to do that. I knew I was going to do that.
Okay. So you knew you were going to get the search warrant, so you didn't need to ask for consent.
Correct.
Okay. So when he's there at the sheriff's office with you on July 5th, you know you're going to get a search warrant to search his house later that night, right?
I don't know if I knew it right at this moment.
Okay. But you didn't bother to ask him for consent to search his house then?
No, I think it's most prudent to lay that information out and get search warrants. That's the best coverage for everyone, in my opinion.
Okay. Okay, so that's a better policy, just to get the search warrant rather than ask for consent?
I believe that's best for everyone.
Okay. But you did some searches regarding Mr. Livingston, right?
I did some searches, yes.
Okay, and those were all consent-based searches, right?
I went to one place that I recall, and I believe it was consent, yes.
Okay, and that was his ranch? Or Mr. Massey's ranch?
Now, that's Mr. Massey's ranch. That wasn't Mr. Livingston's ranch.
Okay.
I went there looking for him, and they allowed me to look around where Mr. Livingston was living. I apologize, I did too, because I also did a storage unit for Mr. Livingston.
Right.
I didn't look at that report before I came.
That's fine. I mean, do you recall, despite not looking at that report, that you searched Mr. Livingston's storage unit pursuant to his consent?
I don't remember if it's consent or search warrant, I'm sorry. I don't recall.
Okay. But at any rate, during the interrogation with Mr. Jones, you don't ask him for consent to search his truck, his car, his home, or his workspace.
Correct.
And that's because you know you're just going to do this search warrant process.
I believe that process is better for everyone, yes.
Okay. But you made it clear to Mr. Jones that you would be getting search warrants to do those searches.
Yes, I believe we just saw it. I told him I was going to seize his vehicle. There's an exception that, since it can move around, I'm allowed to seize it pending a search warrant.
And then you said in addition to seizing your truck, we'll be getting warrants for searching.
Yes.
When you conducted this interview on July 4th, July 5th. When you conducted this interrogation on July 5th of 2007, former investigator Beverly Gerald was the lead investigator, right?
Yes,
And you were not the lead.
correct.
Were you one of the leads?
No, not at that time, no.
Okay. Were you assigned to be the lead on this investigation when she's out of town?
At some point I was, just more of a, not when she was out of town, more as a secondary. I know I covered a weekend of calls one weekend, and I don't remember when it was a week or two down the road, where I was assigned kind of as a second, where if she's gone, then whatever's happening at the time, I'm supposed to make sure it moves forward.
Okay. So as a secondary, you're not the lead, you're the secondary to the lead.
Right, lead helper. I don't know how else to say that.
So how did you come to do this interrogation with Mr. Jones? Who assigned it to you?
I don't recall. I know that at the beginning of that day, assignments were being given out, and if he chose to come down for an interview, I was told to interview him.
Now, in this interrogation, you and Mr. Jones mentioned this woman named Gail, right?
Yes.
And that's Carol Linderholm?
Yes.
And she was interviewed on July 4th, the day before, right?
Yes, I didn't do that interview, but I know she was interviewed.
Okay. And it was, at least in part, her interview the day before that led the sheriff's department to Mr. Jones.
Yes.
And just to be clear, while you're with Mr. Jones at the sheriff's office, investigators are at Bob Scott's searching and interviewing Bob Scott, right?
Yes, I didn't have a lot of information from them. That was kind of occurring at the same time, so I
Sure.
didn't have some of that information.
And another thing that was happening at the same time was the interview of Elaine Jones at her workplace, right?
Right, I found that out during one of those breaks. I found out that somebody had sent people to go contact her and interview her.
And you're also aware that investigator Gerald and Ellers are in New Jersey interviewing George Coralluso at the same time, right?
Yes.
Now, we already talked about how this wasn't, how Mr. Jones hadn't made an appointment with you to come down and do an interview with him, right?
Correct? I'm sorry, I thought I said that, yes.
Yeah, you did. I'm just
Okay.
wanting to reorient you back to that topic. So would you agree that as an investigator that that's sort of the point, is that you want to do interrogations more on the fly than pre-planned?
Sometimes, depends on the case.
Okay. Now, is it at least in part because you want to try to get information quickly?
Sometimes, depends on the case.
Okay. Well, I guess, okay, it depends on the case. But, so does it also sometimes help just to sort of catch people off guard?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And then that sort of prevents people from preparing or polishing their answers if they know they're gonna have an interview, right?
In some ways, yes.
And again, in the case of this interrogation with Mr. Jones, that's what happened. It was spur of the moment.
Yes, he did not know, he didn't have an appointment. He did not know he would be going to his work.
Now, when Investigator Pechoda takes him to get his fingerprints and his palm prints, and when you get his DNA samples, that type of evidence is called non-testimonial evidence, right?
Correct?
Because it's evidence he's not speaking, it's not words, right?
Right.
Now, that was the first of 2 times in the course of this investigation that Mr. Jones got his non-testimonial evidence, or gave non-testimonial evidence, right? You're not aware?
I don't know that I know that answer, maybe.
Okay, that's fine. So you're not aware of a second time?
I know I didn't do a second time.
Okay. Now, the room that you talked to Mr. Jones in is about 8 feet, 8.5 feet by 10.5 feet, right?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. So obviously, it's not very large.
Correct?
There's a table and 3 chairs.
3, there can be 4, but yes, usually 3 in there.
And in the case of this interrogation, there were 3 people in there.
Yes?
And there's no windows in that room.
Correct?
It's not decorated.
Correct?
There is a little, what is it, a one-way mirror for where the camera can record?
It's not little, but yes, there is one.
Oh, okay. It's pretty obvious then.
It's bigger than that window to that door back there.
Okay. Now, you testified previously, perhaps when you were testifying about the cell phones, that you were assigned to the complex crimes unit, right?
Yes?
And you've been assigned to the complex crimes unit since 2005?
Yes.
And I take it, since it's called the complex crimes unit, that you investigate complex crimes,
Yes?
not easy crimes?
Yes. Sometimes some are easier than others.
And so it takes a lot of training to get to be a complex crimes investigator, right?
Yes?
And one of your main jobs as an investigator is to talk to people,
Yes.
all sorts of people, right?
Yes.
Suspects, witnesses.
Victims, yes, all, the full gamut.
And part of the reason that you need to be talking to so many people is that's how you get your information, right?
Yes.
And you're trained on how to talk to these different groups of people.
Yes.
And obviously, one type of person who it's important to get information out of are suspects.
Yes.
And this is an important part of investigating a crime, right, is talking to the suspect, because that would be the person who might have the best information about what happened and how it happened.
Well, in cases, often there's lots of people who have information who may or may not be involved. My job as an investigator is to talk to people and try to determine if there's a way to get them off the list, for lack of better terms. It's my job, is to talk to people and find out, is there information that eliminates them, has a possibility of being involved in a case. So I often do that. If you have cases like this where there's a lot of people, my job is to talk to them. They have information, they know where they were or where they weren't, and figure out and try to narrow down that list.
Okay. Okay. I think I have 2 questions about that then. Because I guess my question was that you would agree that the person you think committed the crime could give you some unique information about how the crime was committed, why the crime was committed, that no one else may have, right?
Yes, that's true.
And so you're trained in special skills for interrogating suspects.
Yes, to get information from people.
Okay.
Yes.
But you're trained to get information, or you're trained to interrogate suspects in a way, to use tactics when you're talking to suspects that you wouldn't necessarily use with a victim or a witness, right?
Correct.
And in addition to your training, it's fair to say that you have a lot of experience in interrogating suspects.
Yes.
And that lot more goes into talking to a person you think may be involved in a crime than just asking them, did you do it, right?
Correct.
Because that would be pretty simple. Anyone could just go up to a person and say, did you do it?
Correct.
And that's not likely to generate the sort of quality information that you are wanting to get out of this particular interview, right?
Correct.
Now, would you agree that when you interrogated Mr. Jones, you used what your training had taught you, as well as what your experience had taught you, to apply these strategies and techniques to this particular interrogation we watched?
Yes.
Now, certainly one technique you use, which maybe you use in all your interviews, is to build rapport with the person, right?
Yes.
And that's because to build rapport is to make someone more comfortable, right?
Yes.
And then that helps them to maybe talk and be a little bit more free-flowing with information.
Yes, that's something you use with no matter who you're talking to.
Sure.
It's helpful.
And you certainly applied that strategy in this interrogation, right?
Yes.
There was conversation about Mr. Jones's work and his 2 grown sons.
Yes.
Now, another technique more specific to interrogations is to minimize the criminal behavior that you think has occurred, right?
Yes.
And maybe to suggest ways that it could be justified.
Yes, in certain people's minds, yes.
Okay, sure. And suggest maybe extenuating circumstances that could explain it or make it seem less bad.
Correct.
And again, this is important because this can help the suspect. Maybe admit a little part of what he did.
Correct.
And one way you can do this is to point out, well, maybe this was an accident instead of intentional.
Correct.
Because the law treats accidents differently than it treats intentional crimes.
Correct.
And certainly we saw this with Mr. Jones, right?
Yes.
Because you did talk to him quite a bit about your theory that this was all some big accident.
That it could be, yes.
Okay. And that it's possible that he didn't intentionally kill Ms. Bergfeld.
Correct.
And you told Mr. Jones several times that you don't think he's a cold-blooded killer.
Yes, I said that.
Okay. And in the face of your suggestions of minimization, leniency, Mr. Jones maintained his innocence.
Yes.
Now, another technique to get a suspect to admit involvement in at least part of the crime is, another technique is to see if the person will admit at least involvement in part of the crime, right?
Yes.
And because this could lead the person to start talking about more and more details
Correct.
that can help you build your case, right?
Correct.
And would you agree that in the very beginning, Mr. Jones, well, at times, Mr. Jones is reluctant to talk about his use of prostitutes, right?
He is not forthcoming with information about that, correct?
Okay. But you do get him to admit that he's hired prostitutes.
On a limited basis, yes.
Okay, sure. But a limited basis is more than no basis, right?
Correct.
He doesn't flat out deny, at least, I'm actually sort of forgetting, but I do know that he doesn't just continually deny usage of prostitutes, right?
Correct. He initially states that he didn't do anything. He did then When I confront him with the information that I know about Gail, then he admits to that, and he admits to using that service one time in the past.
Okay. And he admits, and he explicitly says that's Models Inc., right? He admits to hiring or calling Models Inc.
Correct.
And these are little parts that obviously tie him to the crime, right?
Yes?
And you're getting him to admit these parts.
Yes, he wasn't forthcoming with all of his usage or calls, and I didn't have the phone records at the time.
Okay. And we'll talk about the extent of the usage in a second,
Okay.
for sure. Now, another thing is that by the end of the interrogation, you've learned about the fact that he's gone down to Bob Scott's Sunday night, right?
Correct.
And you confront him on that.
Correct.
And he admits to you, yes, that he'd gone down Sunday night to Bob Scott's.
Yes, he does.
So even as he tells you that he's hired prostitutes, specifically Models Inc., went to work around the time the car was on fire, he still tells you that he did not kill Ms. Bergfeld.
Correct, that's what he says.
Now, another important technique in interrogating suspects is to appeal to their humanity and sense of decency,
Correct?
and their sympathies even.
Correct?
Because it can be helpful to make them feel bad, right?
It can be, correct?
And that their guilt or conscience will lead them to disclose information to you.
Correct?
And you use this technique with Mr. Jones, right, as we saw?
Yes?
You talked to him quite a bit about Ms. Bergfeld's 3 young children
Yes?
and how little they are now.
Yes.
Or they were at the time, and that they need closure, right?
Correct?
And that he can help them get that closure
Correct?
and help make sure that they don't, I think your words were, be messed up for the rest of their life.
Probably something to that effect.
Okay. But Mr. Jones remained firm that despite feeling bad for those 3 young children, he did not kill or kidnap their mother, right?
That's what he said.
Another tactic, would you agree, is to make sure that the interrogation lasts a long time?
Depends on the person, yes.
Okay. Now, when you have a person that you want to have the interrogation last a long time for, that's because it can sort of wear down the suspect, right?
Yes.
And a prolonged period of pressure can make the suspect sort of get tired and less guarded.
Yes.
And maybe then they'll just sort of give up and confess.
Sure.
So after 2 hours and 45 minutes, Mr. Jones still maintained his innocence.
Correct, that's what he said.
Another tactic is pregnant pauses, right?
Correct.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Correct.
Oh, correct.
I'm sorry.
Okay. And uncomfortable silences?
I don't know if I would call it uncomfortable silence. I would say giving them the opportunity to talk.
Okay, but there's periods of silence.
Yes.
And, okay, to give them an opportunity to talk. So Matt, maybe by that, do you mean they will break the silence with information?
Yes.
And in this interrogation with Mr. Jones, we saw you use that tactic, right?
Correct.
There were some long pauses.
Correct.
And sometimes he broke them and sometimes you broke them.
Correct.
And when he broke them and spoke, Mr. Jones said, "I didn't do it."
I don't remember if he said that right at the end, but I do know he said it.
Okay. Another tactic when interrogating a person you think maybe committed a crime is to posit a theory of guilt, right?
Correct.
To show that you know what happened
Correct.
and how it happened.
To infer that, yes.
To infer that, okay.
Yes.
And the purpose of this is to see if the suspect will go along with your theory.
Correct.
And this again, obviously, is to see if the suspect will give you more information.
Correct.
So you explained in this case to Mr. Jones your theory again that this was an accident, that the sex got exciting and something happened. I think you said a side of him came out that normally doesn't come out. You remember all that?
Correct.
And in the face of this theory of how you suspect this might have happened, Mr. Jones maintained his innocence.
That's what he said, correct.
And similarly, another tactic is to have an air of confidence about the evidence that you have, right?
Correct.
And to project a certainty about his guilt, about the suspect's guilt.
Correct, to infer that, yes.
Okay. And to also really say with confidence that there's incontrovertible evidence to support your theory of guilt, right?
No, I wouldn't agree with that classification. I would say that there are often things that are left behind, and so I definitely tell people about that and tell them that, there's usually that one thing.
Okay. When you testified before, you did agree that a tactic is to infer or to state that you have evidence, that you have strong evidence.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I infer that. Yes, I do.
Okay, so I want to, okay, and so the point of this is to infer that you've got the evidence, you've got what you need to build a case against this person, so they might as well just fess up, right?
Sure, that's
And
a
then-
reason, sure.
And then they confess and you've got a big piece of evidence,
Sometimes,
regardless of whether or not you really did have all that evidence you said you had.
sometimes.
Okay, so in this case, I guess I have a question because you keep saying you infer this. Meaning, do you mean by, when you use the word infer, do you mean that you don't say it explicitly?
No, in this case, I said, there's always that one piece, and we're going to have that. And we had a lot of evidence from the car. Fires burn really hot. So I know that we did not come up with any DNA evidence at the car.
Okay. Well, you're getting a little bit ahead of me because what I wanted to talk to you about was that you do tell Mr. Jones, one piece of evidence against him is that he works very near, your words, a stone's throw away from where.
Yes, yes, he does.
Okay.
Or he did.
Okay. And that was a piece of evidence that you knew you had
Yes,
and you confronted him with it.
yes,
And you told him, in terms of this air of certainty, you told Mr. Jones many times that you know you're right and he knows you're right, right?
I know I said that a couple times, yes.
Okay. And that, in fact, you also said a couple times, everybody in the room knows you're right.
Right, correct?
In the face of this confidence on your part and certainty on your part, Mr. Jones maintains his innocence.
Correct?
Now, the final tactic I want to talk to you about when you're interrogating a suspect is your ability to use deceit and trickery, right?
Correct?
And so that means that you can tell the suspect that you have information about their guilt that maybe you don't have.
Correct?
And when you interrogated Mr. Jones, this is July 5th of 2007, right?
Correct?
So that's less than a week into the investigation.
Correct?
And really, the sheriff's office had just found out about him the day before.
Correct.
So on July 5th, you really do not have very much evidence against Mr. Jones.
Correct?
But you did tell him that you had evidence you didn't have.
Oh, yes.
And like you mentioned before, you told him that there was a piece of evidence that he left behind.
Yes, I believe I said something to the effect that there's always that piece of evidence behind.
Okay, and you say more than that. You say there's always that piece of evidence left behind, and there was.
Yes,
But at that point, you certainly didn't know that, right?
I knew we had a car. What was in there, what DNA, what fingerprints, I didn't know that at the time,
Okay.
correct?
And so you don't say to Mr. Jones, we're beginning to collect evidence, we're gonna see what we have, we're gonna send some in for testing, and we might find something, we'll see.
I did not say that.
You say, there's evidence, there's always evidence left behind, and there was in this case.
Correct.
Now, you mentioned before, I think, I want to go back to something else you said, that when you bring in a suspect to interrogate them, you're trying to cross them off the list. Is that what you said?
Well, if we have a situation where there's a bunch of different people that we're talking to, we're trying to figure out which people may or may not be involved. So you have to talk to them to try to figure out, okay, this person can't be involved. You're trying, if you have hundreds of people that possibly have contact with somebody, you're trying to narrow it down. Yes.
Okay. And so at this point, investigators had talked to Mr. Livingston.
I don't recall if it was before or after this. I apologize.
Okay.
I
Would
didn't
you,
look at those reports.
do you feel safe to say it was around the same time?
I believe it was around the same time.
Okay, and Mr. Coraluzzo, right, we already talked about.
Yes.
Would you agree? Oh, I'm sorry. In the beginning of the interrogation, you start out, right, by just asking Mr. Jones to tell you what he had done the week before, right?
Yes.
And the week before, at that point, was the week Ms. Bergfeld had gone missing, right?
Yes.
And he tells you that that week was pretty much like any other week.
Yes.
He goes to work, he goes to a Law&Crime dinner, nothing out of the ordinary.
Yes.
And so you press him for more details, right?
Correct?
And you know about the meeting, right, with Ms. Linderholm on that Wednesday.
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Jones doesn't mention, oh yeah, by the way, there was this one evening where I had a prostitute over, invited her into my marital home and had a nude massage with her, right?
Correct.
He didn't just volunteer that detail.
No.
And then, as we talked about, you learn while this interrogation is progressing that he'd gone to the shop Sunday night to turn the lights out, right?
Yes.
And this obviously is a suspicious piece of information since it coincides with when the car was on fire, right?
Correct?
And you take note that he didn't volunteer that either, right?
Correct.
And I guess, would you agree, Investigator Norcross, that when, in your experience as an investigator, when people are just sort of following their normal routine, they don't always remember every single detail of it?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends on who I'm talking to.
Okay. And that when something is maybe not of particular, obviously the fire and Mr. Jones going to his work at the same time, that's of import to you, certainly, right?
Correct, and I had asked him, I believe, right before that, before I tell him I know that, I had asked him, did you go anywhere else? And he said no, and I knew
Okay.
that was not true.
Okay, and he also didn't mention running the errands that Mrs. Jones talked about either, right?
Correct. I think he talked about doing some things Sunday morning. I can't remember, but
Okay.
yes.
But he doesn't mention anything about going to Okagawa Farms, right?
No, he does not.
Or True Value or anywhere like that, right?
No, and I think by that point I was specifically asking him about Sunday night.
Wait, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I think by that point I was asking him, I think I specifically asked, what'd you do Sunday night?
Okay, but I guess before then, you were talking to him, you're just trying to see what he'll tell you about Sunday in general, right?
Correct?
And he mentions going to the shop in the morning,
Yes.
and then I think you say what else, and he talks about Mrs. Jones doing some laundry, right?
Yes.
Leaves out the errands,
Yes.
leaves out going to the shop.
Yes.
And you've certainly heard people when you talk to people, like, you know, you're asking them what happened last week or what they did the other day, and they say things like, well, I can't even remember what I had for breakfast, right?
I have heard that before, yes.
Because if it's not of import to them, it maybe didn't stick in their mind.
Correct.
Now, we talked already a little bit about how Mr. Jones wasn't, as you say, forthcoming with his use of prostitutes, right?
I believe I said he wasn't forthcoming with some information about his activities, yes.
Okay. By activities, you mean prostitution activities?
Yes, not just that, but yes.
Okay. It was, you start this interview, obviously, you start this interview by just getting some basic information about Mr. Jones, right?
Yes,
And running out and getting your soda and coming back.
yes.
And it's actually at about 12 minutes in that Mr. Jones does admit to hiring somebody from Models Inc.
After I brought out the information, correct.
Okay.
I believe on the time, I don't remember if it's exactly 12 minutes.
Would you
but-
agree with me that it's pretty early on you show him the picture of Ms. Bergfeld, right?
Yes,
And you,
But-
and don't you ask him, do you know this woman who's missing? And he says, I think I know a person who works for her.
yes,
And that was early on in the interrogation.
yes, but he didn't, it took a while for him to discuss how he knew her, and are you talking about that or his visit with with Gail or Ms. Linderholm?
Well, I guess what I want to be explicit on is that it's pretty early on in the interview that you get this detail from him that he has a connection to Models Inc., that he had hired them just the week before.
After I bring that information to him, yes.
Okay. And by bringing this information to him, it's because you begin by asking him if he knows why he's there, right?
Correct?
And he indicates that Investigator Pachota had told him it was about a missing woman.
Yes?
And you show him the picture, I mean, presumably you're showing him a picture of Ms. Bergfeld, right?
Yes, in the beginning, yes, and he says he doesn't know the person, but then he says he does.
Okay. But that's not what I'm asking you, Investigator Norcross. What I'm trying to be clear about is that when you show him the picture, is it a picture of Ms. Bergfeld?
I believe so.
Okay. Who else would you be showing him the picture?
The only person I can think of is if we had a picture of Carol, and I don't recall having one.
Okay. So you believe you show him a picture of Ms. Bergfeld, right?
Yes.
And you ask him, do you know her?
Yes,
Okay, and he says no.
Correct.
But I think I know somebody who works for her.
yes, he says something to that effect, yes.
Okay, because I hired someone from her company last Wednesday, right?
I'd have to watch it again. I don't recall him talking about the last Wednesday until I bring up, we have talked to this person and we talked to a person, did you have somebody that comes out?
Okay. May I approach the witness?
Yes, you may.
I have page 22 of the transcript, 2746 of discovery. So Investigator Norcross, what I have here is the transcript of the interrogation, right? Do you agree with that?
Yes, well, I agree, it looks like it.
Okay. And turning here then to page 22, you're asking him if he knows the woman that's missing, right?
And he says he doesn't, correct?
And that he thinks he knows somebody she works with.
Yes, but he doesn't know her, yes?
Okay. And that he's done business with Models Inc.
He believes that she's the one with Models Incorporated in the newspaper.
Okay. And then says that he's done business with them.
Yes,
Okay. And then you ask how often.
correct?
He says twice.
Correct?
And you say, tell me about those times.
Yes,
And then you ask him, when was the last time? And he says Wednesday.
correct.
Okay. And I guess while I'm here, Investigator Norcross, this is a 92-page transcript, right?
Yes,
And this conversation, or this exchange is on page 22.
yes.
So pretty early on.
Quarter way in, yes.
Okay. Mr. Jones indicates, when you're talking about Gail, who we know as Carol Linderholm, he expresses liking her, right?
Correct?
Describes her as a nice person.
Correct?
And he also indicates that he actually chose Gail.
Yes. Well, yes, he chose from the descriptions on the phone, I believe he said, yes.
Okay, so maybe like he was given a choice of some different women and he picked Gail.
I believe he mentioned they were described to him. I don't recall if he knew the name.
Sure,
But
okay,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. So he corroborates then what the sheriff's department learned about how Ms. Bergfeld answers her phone like an operator.
Yes.
Because there's a part, right, where you're like, you've talked to her, and he's like, I don't know if I've ever talked to her, I talked to the person on the phone.
Correct.
Now, at one point in this interrogation, you point out to Mr. Jones that he seems nervous to you, right?
Yes.
And by that you mean he was displaying what appeared to be typical nervous behavior?
Yes.
Now, on July 5th of 2007, you'd never met Mr. Jones before.
Correct.
So you don't really know what Mr. Jones's typical nervous behaviors are.
Specifically his, no.
And so you don't know how Mr. Jones acts when he's nervous.
Correct.
But in your experience, one typical sign of nervousness can be a person having closed off body language.
Can be, yes.
Okay. Like crossed legs and arms.
Correct?
And there were certainly times where we see Mr. Jones cross his legs and arms, right?
Correct?
And one of those times is when you're asking him about his sex life and his use of prostitutes.
Probably.
Well, I don't remember if you explicitly tell Mr. Jones this, but you've worked a lot of sex crimes, right?
Yes?
Maybe you do, and you are used to talking to people about sex.
Yes?
So it doesn't make you nervous,
Not at all.
and you try to make them less nervous because you're not nervous.
Correct. And I do. I talk with people about this a lot.
Okay.
And so we work through that with people all the time.
Okay. So you recognize that for a person who doesn't spend their days talking to people about sex, it can be a little nerve-wracking.
Yes.
And
That's why I work with people and talk with them about that.
Sure. One of your skills you've developed through your experiences to try to put people at ease while they're talking to you about their sex life.
Yes.
So, in addition to talking about his sex life, I mean, Mr. Jones here is talking to you about hiring prostitutes
Yes.
and necessarily infidelities to Mrs. Jones.
Yes.
And you would agree that these are embarrassing topics.
Yes.
And you do your best to put people at ease, but it might not always work.
Correct.
Now, we talked about, maybe I misstate your language, so correct me if I'm wrong, but Mr. Jones wasn't forthcoming with you about his use of prostitutes, is that what you said?
About several different pieces of information, yes.
Okay, was one of these using prostitutes?
Yes.
Now, you agree that using prostitutes might be something that a person wants to hide?
Yes, I've talked to people about it before, but yes.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I've talked to people about it before.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
So not everybody hides it.
I don't know that anybody wants to talk with us about it, but we talk about it and work through that.
Okay, and cheating on their wife might be a difficult thing to be upfront about too, right?
Yeah, I talk to a lot of people about that having to do with a different part of my job.
Okay. What part of your job is that?
When it comes to sexual assaults, and sometimes in particular sexual assaults on children, if it's involved in the home, inherently there is cheating, and often those
I
people are having other relationships. I
Okay.
talk about that a
So
lot.
this is something you have to talk about a lot in your job?
Correct, and I talk with people about that.
Okay. But this is not something Mr. Jones talks a lot about in his job, right?
Probably not.
Okay. And as we already established, Mr. Jones began by admitting to you that he did call prostitutes
Yes,
and actually had hired them.
yes,
He does indicate that maybe it's more of a sporadic or infrequent thing, right?
he says he did it twice
Twice. Okay, but
with the
then,
Models Inc.
okay, twice with Models Inc. and then sort of maybe mentions another one a year, or doesn't he talk about hiring another woman at some point too? A non-Models Inc. woman?
I don't recall, I don't believe so.
Okay. So when you're talking to Mr. Jones, he mentions hiring Models Inc. twice, but your investigation uncovers a lot more usage of prostitutes by Mr. Jones, right?
Definitely a lot more calls.
Okay. And, when Mr. Jones, so when you're talking to Mr. Jones in this interrogation, he doesn't talk to you about the information that that Investigator Berg ends up finding at his workplace with that list of women, right? He doesn't
No.
volunteer that.
No,
And he doesn't volunteer that he's gone online before on adult dating sites, right?
correct,
And he doesn't bring up the track phone, right?
correct,
And he indicates to you that no other women besides Mrs. Linderholm had been to his home, right?
I believe so, yes,
And your investigation uncovers that some other prostitutes had been to his home, right?
correct,
So it's fair to say that Mr. Jones did not tell you the extent of his extramarital activities.
correct,
And you point out to him at one point towards the end that there's more issues here than are being spoken about.
correct,
And at this point, you really have no idea what Mrs. Jones knows about the extent of Mr. Jones's use of prostitution, right?
correct at that point, correct.
And you have no reason to believe she's okay with it.
I don't know.
Okay,
Are you asking me at that time if I know?
yeah.
I have absolutely no idea.
Okay, you have no idea if she's okay with it or not.
I don't know.
Okay. But you have no reason to believe that a woman, a married woman would be okay with this sort of thing, right?
I can't say that.
Okay.
I've met some who are.
Okay. And at this point, you don't know when you're talking to Mr. Jones whether or not this was a secret part of his life that he was trying to keep from his wife.
I don't know.
And you didn't know whether Your Honor, I'm not too far from being done, but I know the court wants to keep us on schedule, so I can break.
Okay, let's go ahead and take a
Okay.
break then. Thank you. We'll go ahead and take our lunch recess, ladies and gentlemen. If you'll please be back, time to get started at 1 o'clock in the courtroom. I'd appreciate it so much. Hope you have a good lunch hour. Please rise for our jury. For the record, our jury has left the courtroom. Investigator, if you'll just be back at 1 o'clock
Yes,
for us,
sir.
I'd appreciate it. Anything else for the record, Mr.
Judge, I
Wade?
think we forgot to tell the court, we do have a swearing in today right at 1 that we'd like to be there for. That would only take us to about 1:10 or so.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. You mentioned it last week, so.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Colvin?
Nothing for us, sir.
All right, maybe I'll try to get a hold of the jury and see if they'll come back at 10 after, if I can reach them. Hi, Joanne, it's Judge Flynn. Would you tell the jury 110?